Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Ethics in Publishing Conference of George Washington University's Master of Professional Studies in Publishing program. It's my pleasure to introduce today's host, Puja Telikicherla. She is Licensing and Subsidiary Rights Manager at American Psychiatric Association Publishing and also an adjunct faculty member in the GW Publishing program. Puja?
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the GW Ethics in Publishing Conference. My name is Puja Telikicherla, and I serve as adjunct faculty in the GW Masters in Publishing program, as well as licensing and subsidiary rights manager with the American Psychiatric Association. John Warren was generous to ask me to help coordinate this event, originally scheduled for April of this year. And I wanted to start today's programming by thanking him for his effort, ideas, and energy. It is inspiring to see such a diverse and talented group of scholars, colleagues, and friends come together to share their experience with us all. What a profound understatement to comment on how quickly life has changed since last fall. John and I met a year ago to outline the contours of this event, to find ways to invite and include new voices, and to revisit recurring themes that affect and shape the publishing landscape. Then the onset of COVID-19 and its many complicated adjustments arrived. Having barely settled into new work-from-home routines, the nation greeted the summer season with heightened awareness of racial and economic disparities in our own communities. We watched as our friends, and often ourselves, got sick, recover, or face other disheartening realities. We bought masks, we stayed in. On one hand, it feels like the worst time for yet another virtual technology-mediated conference. But then again, what better time to deeply engage in the essential conversations that shape and challenge the ethical considerations of our work? How can we thoughtfully restructure editorial process and address the power of language in our manuscripts? Where do our workflows around peer review and author relationships benefit from a humane approach to supporting scholarship? Are we ready to shift from a wish list diversity initiative and instead create pragmatic toolkits that empower engagement and visibility for all voices? Is this really the time to ask colleagues to help lay down paving stones and advance the cause so that we can all move forward? Why now? But why not now? A few years and several thousand miles ago, I met Niccole Leilanionapae aina Coggins, then a Mellon Diversity Fellow, when we both worked at the University of Washington Press. Her deep passion for truly inclusive publishing struck me then, and it continues to inspire me as her work has transformed into an approachable, tactical instrument for effecting change. It is a distinct pleasure to welcome her in this context as she shares her collaborative project, the Antiracism Toolkit for Allies, along with Dr. Margaret Fraiser and Randy Townsend. Please allow me to introduce them. Dr. Margaret Fraiser joined the American Geophysical Union in April 2020 as Director of Diversity and Inclusion. Randy Townsend has worked for the American Geophysical Union for more than 14 years. He is a member of the Council of Science Editors and the International Society of Managing and Technical Editors Programming Committee, and serves as co-chair on the Society of Scholarly Publishing's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Niccole Leilanionapae aina Coggins is the editorial design and production coordinator and assistant project editor for the University of Virginia Press. Before UVA, she was a Mellon University Press Diversity Fellow at the University of Washington Press in Seattle. Friends, the time remains now. I welcome you again and turn it over to our first speakers.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank Puja and John for inviting us to present. I would also like to thank Randy and Margaret for joining me in this presentation. My name is Coggins. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And before I begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Fort Washington, Okokeek, and George Washington University reside on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostia peoples, who have served as stewards of the region for generations. The University of Virginia sits on traditional water and lands of the Monacan people and on land worked by countless enslaved people of the African diaspora. I also want to acknowledge that this toolkit would not have been possible without the collaboration of Melanie Dolchek at Society of Scholarly Publishing, Jocelyn Dawson and Gisela Fossato at Duke University Press, the Triangle Scholarly Communications Institute, and over 50 participants from across scholarly publishing. So let me get into the background of the toolkits. Our toolkits were inspired by the American Alliance of Museums Guides for Transgender Inclusion. We encourage everyone to go to their website and check out their guides. You'll notice on the slide, AAM has a co-workers guide, an institutions guide, and a transition professionals guide, which we've mimicked with our Anti-Racism Toolkit for Allies, Anti-Racism Toolkit for Organizations, and Anti-Racism Toolkit for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Our toolkits are based on the work by the Racial Equity Institute and Allies for Change. C4DISC, or the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications, is hosting our toolkits. Please go to the website c4disc.org/toolkitsforequity/ to download a copy of the Allies Toolkit if you haven't done so already. C4DISC has also agreed to facilitate the development of the next two guides, our guide for organizations and our guide for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And C4DISC is now recruiting for volunteers for these two toolkits. So please go to the website and complete the working group application. We are hoping to kick off the work on these two guides in the coming months. Our toolkit has 4 appendices going from left to right on the slide. Appendix 1 is a chronology of white supremacy, historical events that have created the system of structural racism in the US. Appendices 2 and 3 include lists of sample equity and inclusion programming from across the scholarly publishing industry. Appendix 4 includes a list of recommended anti-racism training organizations. This list includes trainers based there in anti-racism, because we know that addressing white supremacy is critical to addressing the inequities in our industry. So how do we define racism? Racism, as defined by the Racial Equity Institute, is social and institutional power combined with race prejudice. It is a system of advantage for those considered white and of oppression for those who are not considered white. It is a white supremacy system supported by an all-class collaboration called white, created to end cross-racial labor solidarity. Dr. Tatum's quote gets the heart of why we chose to use an anti-racism framework. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on a conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racist ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go to the same destination as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. So how do we define anti-racism or being an anti-racist? We prefer the definition by Ibram X. Kendi. one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea, one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. In 2016, a survey found that our industry, the publishing industry, was 79% to 91% white. And it was primarily for three reasons. One, personal networks, which tend to be overwhelmingly racially homogenous. Secondly, historically, publishing has relied on the labor of unpaid interns and low-paid entry-level positions. The industry needs to create on-ramps for people who do not have an economic advantage. Our jobs are not rocket science. Everyone can learn how to be a publisher. And third, hiring organizations prioritize applicants with previous industry experience, i.e. unpaid internships, rather than those with transferable skills. More data on our industry of the demographics of our profession. In 2019, Lee and Lowe did a survey which included university presses. And you'll see that the industry overall is 76% white, and then it fluctuates when it's broken into departments. On the slide are two excerpts from two scholarly kitchen articles titled "On Being Excluded, Testimonies of People of Color in Scholarly Publishing." So starting with the one on the left, during a diversity training at the press, we were asked when we first realized what our racial identity was. A middle-aged white woman at the press turned to me and laughed. "Well, you probably came out of the womb knowing." Her exclamation made clear to me how white people assume they are the default and that they are the only people without a racialized identity. Of course, I did not come out of the womb knowing that I was brown, and instead learned that I was brown sometime in elementary school through comments, this one, and treatment that made me feel othered. The testimony on the right, editors took many non-Black interns under their wing, and they were given numerous opportunities to rise up in the press. Black interns, on the other hand, were heavily micromanaged, and there was little interest in bonding with them or making them feel at home. I saw several white interns elevated to permanent positions. This is something I never saw offered as a possibility to Black interns. I did my best to provide some sense of belonging to the Black interns when I could, but honestly, how could I provide a feeling of belonging if it was something I ever felt there myself? And here's an overview of the 5 steps to becoming an ally. 1, become conscious of white advantage. 2, listen to people of color without judgment or defensiveness. 3, move out of social segregation and develop truth-telling relationships of accountability. 4, take action to interrupt racism and white privilege at all levels. 5, create work communities where everyone thrives. And now I'll get into the meat of each step. So step 1, become conscious of white advantage. When many of us think about inequality, we often turn our focus to marginalized groups to see that inequality. But what about trying to see the advantages that dominant groups hold? The work of seeing the advantages granted by white supremacy is a crucial step to seeing whiteness. One of the tools we recommend for seeing the advantages of the dominant culture is Peggy McIntosh's Invisible Knapsack. It is useful for helping to begin to unpack the advantages of white supremacy. It can be easily Googled, but here are 4 examples. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area I can afford and in which I would want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. My white colleagues, my white collaborators on this project shared that by coming to terms with white advantage, it allowed them to fully come to terms with their own race. It allowed them to start to see all the advantages that have existed throughout their lives and continue to play out in their day-to-day lives. It allows them to start noticing racial dynamics on a regular basis. And once they learn to always notice race, who's in the room, who is not, who is at the table, who is speaking, who holds power, they can start to be aware of their own role in those situations. Step 2, listen to people of color without judgment or defensiveness. This step means having difficult conversations, which will not be easy, especially at first. But Black, Indigenous, and people of color are making themselves vulnerable by sharing their experiences. So listen to how we all inadvertently other and perpetuate white supremacy. It is a gift that can lead to personal growth and relationship building. We recommend staying away from any of the defensive or distancing tactics that are on the right side of the slide, proving credentials, denial, minimization, justifying our own biases, focusing on intent rather than impact, competing victimization, and deflection. And instead, we want to encourage you to engage in active listening. And we recommend the LARA approach for receiving and giving feedback. L, listen, with the goal of developing empathy for the speaker. Set aside your own perspective. A, affirm, with the goal of building connection. R, respond, with the goal of addressing the speaker's questions or concerns directly. A, ask questions, add information, again, with the goal of furthering our understanding of the speaker's point of view. Francesca Ramsey recommends the following strategy for responding to criticism. Acknowledge what went wrong. Avoid using conditional words like but or if. Thank the person for bringing the mistake to your attention, because again, they're making themselves vulnerable by bringing that mistake to your attention. And then do not just apologize with words, but change your behavior and do what you can to mitigate the impact of that mistake. Step 3, move out of social segregation and develop truth-telling relationships of accountability with diverse groups of people. This step emphasizes that becoming trustworthy allies is something that white people cannot do on their own. It is work that must be done with humility and in partnership with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Otherwise, it is likely that white people will do more harm than good. Moving out of social segregation will require intentionality because so many of our communities and workplaces have been segregated for so long. Resisting white supremacy in the scholarly publishing workplace, here are 3 examples. Before conference travel, consider who we are reaching out to for meals and meals and try to diversify that with each conference. Check in with our coworkers if we think we have witnessed or committed a racialized microaggression in the workplace. If a Black, Indigenous, person of color, or BIPOC colleague raises a concern that is ignored or dismissed by the group, circle back to amplify their statement. 2 more examples. If an author requests a style or spelling that does not follow our usual copy editing guidelines, for example, retaining Chinese characters for place names throughout a text in English, make sure that the copy editor knows to respect the author's preference. Better yet, find a copy editor familiar with the language used in the article or book. Post all jobs and internships publicly and interview at least 3 candidates who have the skills to learn the job. Step 4, take action to interrupt racism and white advantage at all levels. This step emphasizes that intervention is both top-down and bottom-up simultaneously, as well as something that happens on an individual, interpersonal, and community level. When racial harm is done in the workplace, bystander intervention can play a key role in reducing trauma. Even when a bystander exchanges a knowing glance with a victim, it can reduce the impact of these incidences. So engage colleagues when they misstep and offer support to individuals experiencing harassment. Give the individual being targeted a chance to respond. If the individual is not prepared to respond, and it's safe for you to do so, directly address the offender. Afterwards, check in with the individual who was targeted and ask them how they are doing and what you can do to help. Create documentation, further conversations with the offender. For more tactics, we recommend ihollaback.org. How should we respond when someone tells a racist joke or uses a derogatory word? How should we respond when someone says that the publishing industry is majority white because there are no qualified Black, Indigenous, and people of color for those jobs? My colleagues talk about issues of race and racism in our organization's publications, but are not outwardly or actively engaged with how the dynamics of racism play out in our office culture. How can I address this disconnect? Given the time and that these case studies are in our toolkit, I will concentrate on one, that there are no qualified Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Since it is a question my toolkit colleagues and I have gotten from other presentations. We recommend being direct and tell your colleague that their comment is offensive and racist. Explain to them that unpaid internships and low-paying entry-level jobs serve as barriers for Black, Indigenous, and people of color from working-class backgrounds to enter publishing. Explain that publishing jobs are not posted widely or written in an accessible manner for people outside of the industry, and few current publishing networks push themselves to expand beyond their overwhelmingly white cultural norms. Point to studies that show that members of search committees tend to hire people, quote, like themselves, end quote. You might also know that an all-white search committee is more likely to hire a white candidate than a diverse search committee. So those are just a few things. There's more for this particular question further in the tool guide. Step 5, create work communities where everyone thrives. This step means examining work cultures, work systems, and workflows that may have white cultural norms embedded in them. Even if this may take more time and energy, it's really important to interrogate these things. For more about how racism can impact work culture, you can look at Tima Okun's handout on white supremacy culture by searching for Tima Okun and white supremacy culture. But to use one of Okun's quotes on how to replace perfectionism. So replace perfectionism by developing a culture of appreciation, where the organization takes time to make sure that people's work and efforts are appreciated. Develop a learning organization where it's expected that everyone will make mistakes, and those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. Now I will turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Fraiser.
Thank you so much, Niccole. So Niccole has magnificently outlined and detailed 5 steps to becoming an ally. And it is my honor to have been asked by Randy and Niccole to speak today about allyship in general and some actions that we can take. So my job here is to support and amplify Niccole's and Randy's voices, and to give some ideas about how to leverage your advantage and privilege into anti-racist actions. So first, I think it's important to really talk about why this is important. Ernest Owens, who is an editor and journalist, says that if we are to seriously combat racism, we need to be brutally honest about how white people should conduct themselves in this fight. So we need to start with what this moment means and our opportunity to help lead positive change. So as Puja mentioned in her beautiful introduction, there are three major upheavals in American society right now: protests of police murders and racial injustice, record unemployment, and a pandemic. And Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans are bearing the brunt of this. Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans are dying at much higher rates than white Americans, according to the CDC. People of color are more likely to be essential workers on the front lines and being exposed to the coronavirus. And with respect to unemployment, overall rates declined in September for white and Asian adults. However, the jobless rates for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans showed no change over the last month, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. All of this is added to the trauma of police brutality of Black bodies. It's been called a pandemic within a pandemic. So why is this important for us? It's because being professional does not mean being divorced from humanity. Sometimes our privilege and advantage let us set aside horrific news and just go about our day. But for many people of color, performing this way is stifling and exhausting. So, allies and allyship, what does it mean to be an ally? Two award-winning authors, professors, and social commentators that I love, Roxane Gay and Ta-Nehisi Coates, say that allies take on the struggle as their own. They say, we need people to stand up and take on the problems born of oppression as their own. We need people to do this even if they cannot fully understand what it's like to be oppressed for their race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, or other marker of identity. In conversations on race and anti-racism like the one here right now, this means us white people. To acknowledge white privilege or white advantage does not mean that white people have not struggled. It's just that our challenges are not related to the color of our skin. So to be an ally is to recognize that though you are not a member of the underinvested and oppressed communities you support, you make a concerted effort to better understand the struggle every single day. You stand up even when you feel scared. We can't just say #ally and think we're good. We must aspire to be an ally all the time. We need to own our mistakes and learn to be okay being uncomfortable. We need to acknowledge that even though we might feel really horrible and sad about things going on, the conversation is not about us. This helps decenter ourselves and our experiences. Allies are powerful voices alongside oppressed ones. We transfer the benefits of our privilege to those who lack it, and we amplify voices of the oppressed before our own. And we understand that our education about these issues is up to us and no one else. So a few ideas about taking action. So there are essentially three levels or planes where in our lives, in our organizations, in our culture, where we can try to make positive change. So to create a cultural shift to one that is anti-racist, we can help make changes at the individual and at the organization institution levels. The reality is that there's more to creating and cultivating an inclusive environment and culture than simply mandating diversity training or facilitating listening sessions or celebrating culturally significant holidays. These actions need to be ongoing and daily. And culture change is the sum of all the individual changes that are happening in an organization. So what can we do as individuals? What power do we have? Culture transformation starts with personal transformation. And so here are some ideas that I have culled together from scholars and social commentators. The first is that we need to listen. Allies listen to voices of people of color. You know, white people in this country aren't very good at knowing when to take ourselves out of things and when to put ourselves in. So we should listen by reading what Black people have written and are writing, by paying attention to what people of color are saying about what helps and what doesn't. Allies educate themselves on issues. It isn't up to BIPOC to inform us or educate us. We need to become more knowledgeable and comfortable discussing race and racism. And we need to expand our comfort zone. People resist changing when things are comfortable, but learning happens when we get outside of our comfort zone. Only by doing the things that make us a little uncomfortable will we see how our whiteness is centered in our culture. So doing things just like talking about race and racism, or going to an event where you are in the racial minority, or inviting someone to coffee who belongs to a group outside of those that you typically socialize with, can help you reflect on your own positionality. And allies do this with a spirit of humility and collaboration, not as a know-it-all or wanting a pat on the back for being so woke. These actions will help you understand that people experience current events very differently. And it's important that allies express some compassion and ask people what they may need and follow through with that. And allies also, we look for ways to use privilege for good and create inclusive decision-making. We need to make sure that, or allies need to make sure that we consider interests and comfort of others when we are organizing conferences, for example. And you can think of ways to do these in your community. So, for example, attending school board meetings and advocating on behalf of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And again, standing with them, not louder than them or in front of them. So Niccole mentioned this in her slides. Hollaback, this is an organization that works on training and information about bystander intervention. And so speaking of ways to use our privilege and advantage for good, Hollaback has developed methods to address harassment or racist statements in the moment. And these are ways to go from being a bystander to an upstander, a person who speaks or acts in support of an individual or cause. The distract, delegate, and document methods are 3 ways that are particularly useful to someone who intervenes on behalf of a person being attacked or bullied. So Hollaback says you can distract. So you can start a conversation with the target, the victim, ask a question, drop something. So de-escalate by an indirect approach. You can delegate, you can get help from someone else, finding a person of authority, and you can document if someone is already helping the target of the harassment. You can video the incident. When microaggressions, so these are those brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to individuals because of their group membership, you can choose direct or delay when these occur in the workplace or within your social groups. So to be direct when a microaggression has occurred or that you've witnessed one, if you hear someone revealing a bias, find the courage to say something in the moment. I have found, even when I get really angry and I want to use some not so nice words, I get a better reaction when I use a tone that is welcoming and non-judgmental. So I use an I statement, like, I have a hard time hearing this microaggression, or I'm feeling pain for the so-and-so people. And you might even choose a question like, why do you say that? Or offer a different point of view, like, actually, my experience has been. And so you can practice this in a safe environment with family or with good friends, so you can build your confidence for when you witness those things in the moment. And then lastly, you delay. This is what Hollaback calls delay. Check in with the person afterwards. Let them download what happened and ask how you can help. So allies are upstanders who speak and act in support of an individual or a cause. All right, so if you want to take allyship to another plane, you can work on change within your organization. And this level of change is about ensuring your processes are aligned with the culture you are trying to create. You transform policies and procedures and practices to be racially equitable and inclusive. So some examples are fair and thriving wages, paid family leave, embedded self-care. And so I wanted to give some examples from AGU, the American Geophysical Union. AGU staff work to make sure that ethical, equitable, and inclusive values underpin and pervade all of AGU's activities, whether they're external to the organization and as well as internal. And so to turn principles into actions, staff input is used to develop and enhance work from home policies, work-life balance, for example. We also have these monthly self-guided discussions addressing race and racism. Colleagues and I try to create a safe place, a place to learn and gain support. We also allow space for grace. So we understand that this can be really touchy and hurtful for a lot of people. So we try to be perceptive and sensitive to these things. So how do we affect cultural change? Cultural shifts can be facilitated by leadership, and research indicates that diversity and inclusion initiatives are more often effective when championed from the top. And so again, as individuals aspiring to be an ally, we can manage up. One way to do this is to forge strong ties with colleagues, to build momentum on important ideas, and to focus on strategic issues. So another example of what AGU is trying to do, we are putting together this leadership academy called Landing, and it's specific to the geosciences, but most of the principles can be expanded to any organization or any group. And essentially what it is we are working to train leaders to go back to their institutions to advocate and implement changes to create inclusive environments. All right, so I just wanted to end my portion on some resources that you can start using now. I'll put a plug here for the AGU Ethics and Equity Center website. There's a lot of information here about webinars and trainings and academic papers on creating inclusive environments and anti-racism. Another website that is really helpful and informative is racialequitytools.org. And one book that we have found to be useful at AGU is What If I Say the Wrong Thing? 25 Habits for Culturally Effective People by Verne Myers. And then there are also TED Talks on implicit biases that we've used for our monthly conversations. And so I'll just end with, it's good to acknowledge that this is hard. This can be uncomfortable, but we need to do the work because it's the right thing to do. And we need to look forward, think about the world we want to live in. We're all part of the system, so we all have a role to play. So thank you. I am going to turn it over to Randy now.
All right. Thank you so much, Margaret and Niccole, for this exciting discussion. I always enjoy hearing these kinds of conversations, and just for the audience, if you have questions, please send them in. I'm going to go through them. But first, I'm going to ask one of my own questions that I have here. So let's just say that I'm a white male in the publishing industry. I'm not a racist, but I'm not actively anti-racist. Why should any of this matter to me? Now I'll open this up to either you, Margaret, or Niccole.
So I'll let Niccole take the first stab if she wants to. But no pressure. No pressure.
No. And I will, because I have been thinking about this in terms of, why would somebody want to become an ally, right? And we have some sort of tactics that you can use in the toolkit for pointing out what's beneficial. But I think for just for me, like, what's in it for you is your humanity. For me, like that's really what's in it for you. And I think as an American, as a historian, I think we're taught a lot about individuality, sort of, or like this hyper individual. You hear about what these individuals. They go west and they get there and they become all these these big important people. But what isn't talked about is the community and the relationships that allowed that particular person to make it across the U.S., and to become a bigger person. I mean, the countless unnamed Black women that uplifted Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I say Reverend and Doctor because he was both, and he earned both. He's sort of raised up as this individual, but it's the community that was behind him, that was underneath him, that allowed him to become the person that we know and value today. So just to be in right relations with people, I would say, to be able to have real conversations, and I'll stop there for now. I could keep going, but yeah, I think I'll stop there.
That was awesome, Niccole.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question in the audience, from the audience here. This is for Niccole also. So Margaret,
okay.
For some strange reason, not to circle back to you, but well, you mentioned job postings being written in non-accessible language. Could you point us examples of non-accessible and accessible postings so we can learn how to improve the language in our postings?
Okay, well, I know that in terms of accessible job postings and the people that I've worked with, I would point to Duke University Press. for their job postings. And then for inaccessible, I would probably take a posting that you have found, maybe just a mainstream publisher, and put it up against one from Duke University Press, and then sort of see it in that way. I know that my colleagues at Duke University Press can speak more specifically to the language and the qualifications and what they put into their postings, but so I would point you in that direction first.
Great, thanks, Niccole.
You're welcome.
Margaret, the current U.S. president has expressed his desire to discontinue federal funding for diversity training. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means for the work we're doing here, and how does that affect long-term goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
It means our work is more important than ever, and we have to push forward. I mean, I think this shows that, this is another way that, basically, why should white people care about this? It's because any injustice, again, to use Reverend Dr. King, any injustice anywhere means there's injustice everywhere. So it opens the door to great abuses of power and of people. And so there are ways to get around it. Maybe don't, instead of saying diversity training, you say professional development or things like that. But I think now is not the time to take our foot off the gas.
Great. All right, so here's another question. Cultural change is like turning the direction of a battleship. It may take some time to see the results you're hoping for. How can an organization retain commitment when there are competing priorities, especially at a time of COVID-19, where organizations are really looking at their financial portfolio?
I can't see Niccole, so but so I don't want to speak before you, Niccole.
Go ahead. I'm fine, back.
I would say, these issues should be your primary, should be of primary importance, because COVID, the coronavirus, all of this is interrelated. You can't just look at one thing in a vacuum and say, oh, well, we took care of that. How can you help with, working from home and work-life balance and all of that without addressing how it is affecting marginalized groups? So I always push back on that. When people say, oh, we have so many other things that we need to be concerned about. Well, if you don't address these issues, you're not going to have anything else to think about.
And I agree. I second that.
All right. Here's another question from the participants. I've always considered myself not racist. I've recently discovered that's not enough. It's important to be anti-racist. I'm glad to know that. What do you think the future is in this regard? What's next?
You mean what's next for the country? What's next for us? As the tool group people, it's getting that organizations toolkit out and the BIPOC toolkit out. That's what's next at least for us as a group. And then I know for me at the University of Virginia Press, it's to start having the conversation about equity, inclusion, diversity. UVA as an institution, has recently announced, I think it was a couple months ago, their own plan for how they will be addressing equity and diversity issues. So I think that might be a way in for the press to have some discussions about what those steps could mean for us as a press, ways that we think we could add to the institution's plans. So I mean, there's a lot that still needs to happen, and just for me personally, I'm going to continue learning and reading. You know, my background is more academic in terms of race and identity and sovereignty and, you know, and anti-racism. And so I had been asked to be a part of the Toolkit group, primarily because of the relationships that I had built as a Mellon Fellow. And then, you know, as we were talking and you know, sort of figuring out what we wanted to happen with these toolkits, and then what we wanted inside them, I realized, I was like, you know, I don't have anti-racism training. You know, what exactly does it mean? And so, because our press is part of a larger institution that has a big human resources department, there were professional development funds for me to attend the phase 1 training of the Racial Equity Institute. That there was a training session that down in Durham that I was able to attend, and so that was just eye-opening because of the history that they talked about. I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm a total history nerd. So, you know, anti-racism history, and then just also meeting other people that were getting the training at the same time. And the room was fairly mixed. I would say maybe half people of color, half white. And, you know, there was a woman that was retired. She had been a nurse. And so this was sort of like a second, you know, she was sort of a second career, you know, training. There was an oncologist that was trying to get at the root of why his Black patients weren't doing as well as his white patients. And so just to see the people and to hear why they were taking this training and what was motivating them, and then to get jazzed that there are people out there, regardless of what you see on the mainstream media, there are people that want to be anti-racist and want to engage in anti-racist work. It's just finding each other and the communities. So that was a really long answer to that question.
All right. Mark, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so speaking from, I'll give the white person aspiring to be an ally perspective. What does the future hold? We've got to step up. It's my point of view, from my reading is, white people, we're inherently racist. We benefit from these structures and institutions, whether we are conscious of that or not. And so we must take action to dismantle, to educate ourselves on ways to dismantle these structures of power.
Great. So one thing I've noticed is, I love these conversations. I'm in, a lot of conversations, and I know you all are as well. And, the different meetings that you're in, you end up seeing some of the same faces, right? And that becomes the choir. So you end up talking to the choir. So, how do you go from not just preaching to the choir, talking to yourselves, to having this message reach other people, which I think is the real intent. You want it to be expanded and exposed and interpreted and adopted. What kind of advice would you have in order to reach some of these other people?
Do you want to pick one of us to go first?
I'll pick on you, Margaret, because you were giving the easy way out earlier.
Oh, no worries. No, I just don't want to center myself. So I'm blanking on how do we get people on? Yeah. Basically work. It's a lot of work. But we must do it. Speaking to white people, how do we get them on board? You talk all the time. You talk to people. You like, ooh, maybe they're on board with this. And then you have a little bit of patience and grace for others who maybe, or family members who, may not see it right away. And you just keep working on it. Yeah, I wish there were a much easier, click this button to be anti-racist, but, it took, centuries and centuries to get here. So it's going to take, I hope not that long, but it's going to take a lot of work to write things.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. Niccole, here's a question. It's not specifically to you, but it's from the audience, and I feel like we can go back and forth a little bit. So try and find some balance. How do we address those who continue to deny the existence of white privilege? As a white male, I feel I can be especially effective advocate, but even I have trouble getting past the refusals of others to admit the system was built to favor a very specific type of person.
Right.
I'm sorry. There was another part to that. Is this addressed in the toolkit for advocates?
Okay. So wait, sorry, could you, I think my feed overlapped with your feed. So could you just repeat that last part, I think?
Sure. It says, is this addressed in the toolkit for advocates? I think it's a toolkit for allies.
Oh, okay. And trying to deal with sort of the denial, the denial of that. Yeah. And that was a conversation that we did have as we were talking about the toolkits. And there were some differences of opinion. There were people that wanted the toolkit to maybe appeal to a more general audience, but we decided that there were just gonna be people that were not ready, and that the toolkit was not for them. That the toolkit was for people that were ready, and were ready to put in the work that was going to be needed. How do you get people to? I mean, we do have in the toolkits, we do talk about what I had mentioned on one of my slides about the sort of the denial, the deflection, and there's different examples like the minimization, the competing victimization, deflection. So there is that part of the toolkit, but that's also kind of sort of why we called it a toolkit, is because there's different parts of the kit that will be useful for some people and other parts of the kit that won't be as useful. So like any tool, right? There's not just one tool for everything that you have to fix and out there in life, So you're going to want to pick the tool that works works for that situation. And so in terms of getting people to accept, I would start figuring out what's behind that person's denial. I think, and I don't know, I mean, Margaret, Randy, you may think this is differently, but I think a lot of it is just based on fear. This fear that somehow, and this actually did occur in our training, in the training session, the 2-day training session. At the end, there was a white male that was like, I get what you're saying. I get it. But then it makes it hard to not see my own accomplishments as, you know, like it was like, I mean, so there was a little bit of this fear that like, oh, my accomplishments aren't my accomplishments. Is that what you're saying? You know, which isn't what the trainers were actually saying. They were like, no, your accomplishments are your accomplishments. We just want you to be aware that there are these other factors out here. We're not dismissing you or dismissing your accomplishments or your parents' accomplishments or your grandparents. You know, we're just saying that there's other people that have accomplishments too that need to be recognized that aren't being recognized because they don't fit the white supremacist model. But then there's, you know, yeah, so maybe I'm complicating this a little bit more. So maybe Margaret, Randy, you guys have.
No, that was awesome. That was awesome. It's definitely that uncomfortableness. Like you said, well, I worked really hard, and it's like, yes, but other people work really hard and harder and don't get acknowledged or recognized. So yeah, there's a bit of that, come to realization moment that I think needs to happen.
Good. All right. There's another question in here from the audience. Can you speak to the importance of members of BIPOC supporting each other across cultures in scholarly publishing? I imagine BIPOC people who want to support other BIPOC members across cultures could adopt the ally tools to do so. I think my question is on the importance of multi-levels of allyship.
Yes. And maybe you should volunteer for the BIPOC toolkit, right? No, I'm saying, I'm being a little, it's kind of fuzzy, but no, that's one of the things that we had, my group, the group that had put together the Allies Toolkit. That's our hope for the BIPOC tool, for the BIPOC tool guide, is that it, which is also why we say in the Allies Toolkit that we recommend that people of color, that BIPOC individuals also go through the Allies Toolkit, because there will be things there that they will, that they can use when they're across difference, right? I mean, and that again was another discussion that we had, like, okay, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that's a huge group. And do we want to group everybody together? And I think that's going to have to be another conversation that the BIPOC working group volunteers will also have to address, because there's anti-Blackness within the Black community. There's anti-Blackness outside the Black community, between people of color. So that that has to be, I feel like that in some ways has to be addressed, and Islamophobia needs to be addressed. So yeah, that's a really great question, and And that's why I recommend that you volunteer to serve in some capacity on the BIPOC toolkit if you are a BIPOC individual. Because we need to be allies. BIPOC individuals, we need to be allies to ourselves. I mean, we've internalized white supremacy. That, we need to be allies to ourselves. We need to be allies to each other within our specific communities, racial communities, and then we also need to be allies across our racial communities within the people of color community. So I'll turn this over to Margaret and Randy if they want to add anything.
That was awesome.
So we have another question from the audience. So it's, how do we get the toolkit? And I will also add a caveat because Margaret seems to slide through with some of these questions. How can they, I'll add also, how can they access the Ethics and Equity Center? So both of you have to share how people can gain access to your respective resources.
Okay, it's c4disc.org. And I think it's /toolkits for equity to download the Allies Toolkit. And also volunteer for the organization and BIPOC toolkits.
And AGU's is just ethicsandequitycenter.org. So just all the words spelled out, run together, ethicsandequitycenter.org.
Perfect. Here's another question. How do you get around people's unconscious fear that it's a zero-sum game, that if someone else is successful, they'll lose?
That question has the potential to get really political. Not that I haven't already kind of sort of gotten political already. So I may punt that question, although I am have something, but yes.
So yeah, I have I'm trying to be good. So there's basically two things. So human rights, it's not a pie. There are rights to go around. There should be rights to go around. And so just because someone else, gains a right that they should have always had does not mean that your right is diminished or goes away. But I will say, and Niccole and Randy, please tell me if you disagree. I think part of white people's reckoning is realizing, hey, maybe I maybe some things just because I was given the benefit of the doubt. Maybe, do you know what I mean? Maybe I'm not as awesome as I always thought I was. And that's part of the uncomfortableness, and at least in my point of view, and what needs to be dealt with. So I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, I'll just kind of jump in on that. I do agree. It really starts with conversations, and sometimes it's individual conversations. So where people may see Niccole and Margaret and I, and we have our position that may be intimidating. That might be their zero-sum game right there, and they're shut down. Mm-hmm. But if you have a personal conversation and bring back the individual humanness to, whatever the issue may be at hand, I do think it opens up the possibility for other considerations from that person that may have those walls built up already.
And I would like to add that one of the goals of the toolkit was to have a shared understanding of to have a shared vocabulary to sort of have a shared history, because in a lot of ways we all have different definitions of the words that we're using, and we're really talking in cross purposes with each other in a lot of ways. And so I'll add that, okay, maybe in some respects it appears to be a zero-sum game. Like, for example, popular culture reference. It was that Hellboy remake, and a white British actor was awarded one of the roles, and the role was for, I think, a mixed Asian American, but definitely Asian American character, and there was a lot of uproar. And so then that actor was like, oh, I didn't realize that, I'm going to step down. And so he relinquished his role. Hollywood could have given him another role in the movie, but chose not to. And then, a very awesome, very qualified Asian American actor was then the replacement, right? And so in that respect, that's a zero-sum game, because Hollywood made it a zero-sum game. They didn't have to, but they did. So I get, in some instances it may feel like, and it will look like it's a zero-sum game. But I have a feeling that particular British actor got a lot of points from other communities that will now support him. So yeah, there's a lot of, it looks zero-sum because I think there are people that want it to be a zero-sum game and this is the part of the Racial Equity Institute's definition of racism that really draws me, is that that racism is a system to prevent cross-racial alliances from happening. That there have been interracial movements long before the Civil Rights Movement that have occurred in our history, in our U.S. history, and that scared the elites. And so they've then put laws in place so that to prevent that cross-racial solidarity that is possible. Yeah. So anyways, I'm rambling along.
All right. Thank you so much, Niccole. Thank you, Margaret. And this is a great presentation, and I'm going to have to end it here, and we will turn it over to Puja.
Thank you so much, Randy. And Margaret, Niccole, and Randy, thank you not only for presenting this anti-racism toolkit and all of its extremely useful components, but for also demonstrating through your conversation that we can have these difficult and uncomfortable conversations and put ourselves in the position to better understand and advance the cause. I'll wrap this up. We do have one more minute before our next talk, but I do want to welcome you to stick around. At 2:15, we're going to have a lovely conversation and presentation from Dr. Elizabeth Rule at George Washington University, where she serves as the director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy. And she's going to share with us the wonderful intersection between Indigenous history and technology. So stick around and we'll see you soon. Thank you.